Good morning. Was that a rocking keynote or what? Welcome to Step 0, Prepare Your Data. I am Terry Roberts. I'm a user experience designer with Tableau. Prior to Tableau, I've done a variety of other applications. I've worked for Intuit, doing financial applications, for PeopleSoft, Sun Microsystems, US West, a phone company, and early in my career, I worked for Xerox, doing Star, the predecessor of the Macintosh. I've been with Tableau for 4 years now, working primarily on data prep, and most recently on Maestro, which you just saw a preview of at the keynote. When I started with Tableau, connecting to data looked like this. That is the dialogue you did a join in. Just very mysterious what was going on. My first project was creating the data source tab that made data prep visual, the way Tableau believes in. So we have the visual join diagram, we have some sample data that we show, and we've been adding more data prep features over the years. Why do we need to do data prep? The data coming in could be incomplete. You need to combine several different files together to have enough records to have all of the data. Or it could be missing some attributes of each record and you might need to join another table in. It could be incomprehensible. The field names could be some kind of abbreviation that nobody knows what they mean. Or the actual data could be codes of some kind and you would need to join in a translation table so that people know what they mean. Or finally, the data could just be in not a good format for processing. And that's what we're going to be talking about in most of this talk. The agenda for today, first of all, there will be a section on getting data into a good format. We'll talk about what is clean data, then the process of cleaning and transforming your data. And once you've done that, everything is quick. Secondly, we'll talk about the PDF connector. That was new in the spring, and I'm sure you're just getting used to it now. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it works best for, and the cases where if it doesn't work perfectly initially, some tips and tricks for getting things to actually work, and you can make a viz from pretty much anything in PDF. Finally, at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. Now, I'm sure you've seen the cycle of data analysis. Tableau shows this a lot. Typically, first you have a task, you get your data, you do a viz, you share it with your friends. But Tableau emphasizes that really you can do these things in any order. And data prep is part of that. So even though I called this step 0, that's kind of a misnomer because anytime you notice that some more data prep is needed, just go ahead and do it. It all works. So let's talk about transforming data into a good format. This is the example I'm going to be using for the first part of the talk. It's a real spreadsheet that came from the US Department of Agriculture about grain prices. It has the data for different years in different subtables on the same page, and the months are in different columns going across. The goal is we would like to be able to do a viz with showing the grain prices over time. But how do we do that? We need some kind of a field that we can put on the x-axis to be our date. We need some kind of a field that is the price that we can bring over, but the price is all over the place, and there is no individual date field. We just can't get there from here the way it is now. What we need to do instead is transform the shape of the data into a data source that has the fields that we need. It has a date field, it has a price field, and grain so that we can see different grains. Once we do that, the viz is quick and easy. Now I'm going to give you a little preview of what we'll be doing. This is not because you need to plan it all out in advance. It's more because if you're doing some of this for the first time, it helps to have a vision in your mind of the steps that we'll be going through, so you sort of have an idea of what's going on. But it's not because you need to think about this every time you do it. We'll talk as we go through it about the cues that you see to let you know that a given process is going to be needed. So what we're going to need to do at this point is, first of all, there's some extraneous rows in this spreadsheet. There's the title. There's a footnote at the bottom. We need to get rid of that stuff. We need to find the field names. Those are in row 3, not row 1, where the Excel connector expects it to be. And finally, there are 3 tables in there that we need to pull out to be able to use. The tool for doing that is Data Interpreter, and data source filters are going to help with some of the extraneous rows. Once we have the 3 tables, we need to combine them. Union is the tool to do that. And usually union, if the fields that you have in your different tables are named exactly the same, it will just put all of the fields from the different records into the same fields in your result. But if it turns out there are some of the fields whose names aren't matching exactly, it'll give you separate fields, and you need to use a function called merge mismatched fields, which does a coalesce to get them all into one field. Finally, we need to get years, and those will come from the names of the tables, and we'll use a feature called groups to help with that. We need to get the months off of all those different field names. We'll use pivot to do that. And, I jumped ahead. We need to turn the years and the months into a date, and we'll use the function dateParse for that. What we'll end up with is clean data. Each row is a record, a single data point, and each field in that record is a single value, and you don't have the same kind of data in multiple fields. Also, we need clear field names for all the fields so we know what we're doing, and clear values so somebody looking at the table afterwards knows what it is that they're seeing. Once we have that, we can create a viz and it'll be easy. Let's switch over to a demo. This is the Excel file that I showed you. It has the 3 tables for the different years. So we'll bring up Tableau, connect to Excel, USDA 15. So what do we get? Kind of what you would expect. It's not so wonderful. That table title at the top turned out to be the first field name, and the rest of them are all F2, F3, F4, not very helpful. The actual field names are in the second record because they were in the 3rd row of the Excel, and so forth. That's not so wonderful. Whenever Tableau reads in an Excel file, or as a matter of fact, PDF also, Data Interpreter takes a peek at the data that's coming in, and if it thinks it could be helpful, it puts up this little note in the left pane of the Data Source tab. Data Interpreter might be able to clean your Excel workbook. It might be helpful. Data Interpreter isn't so solid that we know it'll always make things better, so we want to have the user look at it without Data Interpreter, with Data Interpreter, and make a decision about whether Data Interpreter is helpful or not. So that's why it's a manual process. We say when we think we can help, let you try it, you make the decision. So it puts up this checkbox that says, yes, I do want to try it. I'll check that and zoom back out. Things are better. We now have good field names. We got 2013 from the first, and all of the months going across. So it's better, but if we scroll, we can see that the next table is just kind of embedded in there as different records. And there's absolutely no way of knowing at this point which subtable each record came from, so you don't know which year that record corresponds to, so that's not good. Another thing that Data Interpreter does, though, is look for the subtables, and it found some. It names them by the name of the Excel spreadsheet that it found it from, plus the cell range that it found as that table. So this is saying it went from A2 to M19. Let's go back to the Excel and check that out. So here's A2, and I'm going out to M19, and yes, that's exactly the first subtable in there. So we can get rid of this complete table from the whole sheet and bring in the first subtable and take a look at it. It's still got the good field names. We have now 16 rows over here on the right. That seems about right. That was about what we had in the spreadsheet. And scroll through the data. Okay, we can see it all. That's looking fairly reasonable. So let's multi-select the other subtables, drag it in. And if we just drop these in the middle of white space here, they would be joined in with the table we already have. But if we move close to this table, the little union drawer pops out from the bottom of the table, and if we drop into this drawer, it goes in, joins up with the table we already have, and adds all the records from the new tables to what we already had before. Now let's take a look. We now have 48 rows instead of 16. That's about right. If we scroll, got a bunch of data. Now, this first field is odd. It's called 2013. It's got a bunch of nulls, then some grains, then more nulls. There's also a 2011 over here, and if I scroll over, a 2012, 2011. Let's change the order of the fields in this data grid to alphabetic so we can see those together. Each one of these came from a different table because it was the contents of the cell in the field name row. And there are different names. All of the other columns had the same field name for all of the tables, so they just all lined up and went into the same field in Tableau. For these years, they didn't have the same name in the different tables, so Tableau says to itself, I'm not positive this is really the same field, so I will play it safe and make separate fields for you. If it turns out they're really the same stuff, you can combine them, and we will because they all contain this grain data. We multi-select, and in any of the fields, we can bring up the menu and say, merge mismatched fields. They're mismatched because they didn't have quite the same name. And that coalesces all of those fields together into one field that contains the information about the grain. So we'll rename it. Okay. Things are getting better, but what just happened? We totally lost all information about the year. Oh no, what can we do about that? Well, Tableau, when we created the union process, we realized that sometimes the name of the table encodes some important information about the data that's in there that you need to know to interpret all of those records. So every time we do a union, we add one or two additional fields to the data source. In this case, there's a sheet field to tell which Excel sheet tab the record came from, and a table name field to tell you the name of the table that each record came from. So let's widen this a little bit and we can see the actual data, and these are the names of the tables, including the Excel cell number that the table came from. Knowing this subtable's name, we can translate from that name, table name, to the year, because we can look back at our spreadsheet and know which is which. How do we do that? There's a variety of ways, any of which could work. We could go in here and create a calculated field. Just say, if it's blah, then 2011, if something else, 2012, that would work. We could do a split so that it would split it down to just the parts that are different in the different table names and then do a calc. I want to show you two other features that are also relevant to this. One is aliases. This is a way of translating from one data value to a data value that's a little bit more explanatory to people, a little bit nicer. So if we select this, this is our table name that goes from A21 to M38, and that is 2012. So this is a really quick and slick way of doing this translation. Next one is 2013, and the last one must be 2011. So if I said okay and closed it, it would change all of these table names into these years. It works really well if you then use this in a viz, and you'll see those nice year names, and it'll come out really well. It turns out, though, that the way Tableau works, this process, the alias process, happens at the very last minute in the process of doing a viz. In this case, we're going to need this year field to put into a calculation to change it into the date, combining it with the month. And that happens earlier in the Tableau process, early in the data engine, so that is before the alias becomes available. So unfortunately, this is really cool, really easy to do, and works well if you're just vizzing the result. It doesn't work if you're going to need to use it in a calc. So I wanted to show it to you for your information, but we're not going to use it right now. So cancel out of that, and I'll show you a different tool that is also a cool thing that does work in this case. Groups are a mechanism that's meant for when your data values contain a lot of different things that mean the same thing. So if our data values were, say, a company field, and it included Tableau, Tableau Software Incorporated, and whatnot, you would want to combine all of those different values into a single value and then say, we're going to call them all Tableau. So there's two things groups does. It lets you take different values and combine them all into one thing, and then it lets you give it a name. In this case, we don't need to combine multiple values into one. That's sort of why this is a trick. But we do want to give it a new name. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use this as a hack for changing the name of these things. So we select A2 to M19. We say this is a group containing one thing, but its new name is going to be 2013. And the next one is a group of one thing. It'll be 2012. And group 2011. And we'll call the whole thing year. And it turns out that this does happen at the right step in the Tableau process so that it will be available to us later on when we want to do a calculation with the result of this. So, okay, and we now have a year field. Cool, we're making progress. We no longer need these two fields that were generated by the union process because we've already made use of them. So let's hide them to just make things a little bit cleaner. And now take a look at what we've got. It's looking pretty good, but there are some records that are like practically all null, except for this year field that we just created. That's not very clean. How can we get rid of that bit of messiness? In the data source tab, you can add a data source filter, which filters things out at the data source level, so it's just not there to bother you in the future. We do it up in the upper right-hand corner there. It says we've currently got 0 filters, and it gives us this little link button to add one in. I'll click that, and it says, gives us a chance to add a filter, and asks us, which field would we like to filter on? Well, any of these months could validly have a null value, but if grain is null, then like the whole record is useless. We don't know what to do with it. There's no grain to know any price of. So let's filter on grain, and we'll say if it's null, we want to exclude. Okay, that's our filter, grain excludes null. We can see out here that we have 48 rows, 48 records in the data source right now, and after we say okay, boom, we have 45. And those null records are gone. Things are getting better. Take another look. What's another thing that's not totally clean here? Well, we've got all these months across the top, but month June kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. How did that happen? Let's go back to the spreadsheet and take a look. The different months were all across row 3 of the Excel file, but up in row 2, there was this subheading month that just happened to appear on top of June. And Data Interpreter, when it looked at that, sort of said to itself, well, I'm not sure exactly what this is. It could be a subheading applying to all of these things, or it could be that it's a 2-row field heading for this field. I'm not sure. I will play it safe and not throw away any words that belong to the user. So if the user wants to throw it away, that's fine. Tableau doesn't want to throw it away. So we know it's okay to get rid of the word month, so we will just do it. And now we have June. Okay, now we've got a year field, a grain field, and now is time for the big transformation. We need to take all of those months and turn them into a month field so that we can make a date. This uses the pivot function, and it's a little bit tricky, so I want to go back to PowerPoint briefly to talk about what's going to happen. So in PowerPoint, I switched over at this demo slide. I'm going to skip a bunch of slides now. What they are is one slide each to show you what we just went through. So when you get this deck after the conference, you have a record of what we just talked about in the demo. But I'm going to skip forward to how does pivoting work. So as an overview, we want to start with the months as multiple columns and the prices as different values within those columns, and we want to end up with a month column with all the months and a price column with all those prices. And you can see why it's called pivot, because it's taking something that was very horizontal and turning it into something that's very vertical. Tableau's process takes 3 steps. First of all, it creates the 2 new columns, the 2 new fields that are going to be needed. And then it has to replicate the records in order to put all of the different months into the new month column. So in this case, it just replicated it 3 times, but in the example we'll go back to, it'll have to make 12 new records for every old record. And then, of course, it replicates the data that was already in there, the grains. So now it says corn, corn, corn for all of the new records, and then soybean, soybean, soybean for all of the next set of records, and so forth. Step 2 is the pivot step. It takes all of those prices that were going out in the different month fields and flips them around and puts them into the new price field that got created. Then step 3 is the final thing that we've already used up all of the information that was in all of those original month fields, and we can just get rid of them. We don't need them anymore. So that is the process that we'll use, and we'll go back to the demo to do that. Now, I could multi-select all of these months, but that's kind of a long selection. So I just want to show you the other way of laying out the grid down here. This is the data grid, shows you some sample data. The other version of the grid is, we call the metadata grid. It gives you a more compact listing of all of the different fields with no sample data. So it's easy here to select all of those months. And then in any of the months, we can bring up its menu and say, pivot, blammo. Now we have the two new fields. Unfortunately, Tableau wasn't bright enough to know what we wanted to call them, so it gave it these boring names, pivot field names and pivot field values, and like, which one is the months, which one is the prices. So let's go back to the data grid so we can see some sample data, and then it's totally obvious which is which. Pivot field names is the months, and pivot field values is the prices. And the spreadsheet said it was in dollars per bushel, so I'll add that. Okay, and I also wanted to mention that over here, our number of rows or number of records in the data set has ballooned. It's gone from 45 to 540 because it's 12 times as many as it used to have for those 12 months. Okay, we're getting close. We've got a year and a month. We need a date. This calls for a calc. Create calculated field, and we'll call it date. And I happen to know that date parse is what I need. Now, when I do calculations, I like to leave that little extension of the dialog box up. It is a real handy-dandy cheat sheet for when you're doing a function that's a little bit complicated. It lets you know some details and some examples of what you need to put into the calculation. So it's telling me that I need to first give it a format to clue it into how to interpret the values it's getting, and then give it the values. So the format I'll give it is to say, first of all, I'm going to give it the year, and then a dot, and then the month, end of string, comma, and this parenthesis is in the wrong place. We'll take it out. Year, followed by a dot, followed by the month. I'll select that, put the closing parenthesis back, and it says, my calculation is valid, yay. So let's do an apply just to see if we got it right, if it looks plausible. Okay, so for the first record, the year was 2012, the month was April, the date answer 4/1/2012. Looking good. Looks safe to put away the dialog box. It added this time to it. That's not very helpful, so we can just really quickly bring up the drop down, change a date and time to a date. Nice. Okay, make sure that this really is right. You need to check more than just one record. Scroll down, now we have 2013, April, 4/1/2013. Looking good. Scroll down some more, here's some August, 2013, okay, looking plausible. Now that we have the date, we don't need the year and the month separate anymore. Hide, hide. Are we good? Ready to viz? Let's try it. Yeah.
Remember what you did, so when your table updates to add 2014, it will automatically update?
When 2014 comes in, it would not automatically bring the new pill for the new table in. But if we went into the data source tab and dragged that into the union, I would think that the whole thing would work. I'm not going to try it on stage, but yeah, I'm guessing that everything else that we've done just extends, but we don't automatically bring in everything from the left pane in the data source just because you brought in all of them the first time. If a new one shows up, we would need to bring that in manually. Okay, so date on the x-axis, and we'll make that a continuous month. Price on the other axis. Okay, sort of shows that the prices are kind of going up, but not too useful. I guess that's because it's summing the prices over all those grains, and that would be better if we divided it out by the different grains. So let's put grain onto color, and it looks like we have some that are so much bigger than the rest that that doesn't look so useful. So we'll be a little bit more selective and put grains on filter. Now, what would we like to look at? Well, I grew up in Ohio around a lot of corn. So let's look at, here's feed corn and food corn. And let's do feed soybean, food soybean. Okay. Okay, we got a viz. Looks like it's working. And we can learn some stuff. I wouldn't have known offhand whether feed soybean and food soybean are practically the same in price or wildly different. This tells us that it kind of tracks in price, but food soybean is just a little bit more expensive than feed soybean, and the same with corn. One other thing to notice here, though, is the gaps in some of these graphs. We have an annotation down here saying 21 nulls, and that seems right. When we looked at the data source, there were a bunch of nulls in there. What do we want to do with them? Well, sometimes it's okay to just leave it like this. Your audience may want to know where you have data, where you don't have data, and it's being honest with them to just leave a gap where there is no data. Other times, depending on your audience, they may want it to be a little bit prettier, and they don't particularly care if some data is missing. You can just gloss over that. You can click on the null wart here, the little null indicator, to change that. I want to show you a slightly different way of doing it. Since the nulls are in the price field, I can click on the price axis, say Format, switch over to Pane, and down at the bottom, there are some controls for letting you say what you want to do with special values such as null. And one of the choices is hide those special values by connecting the lines, or hide the little null indicator and connect the lines is what this means. And so we just click on that, and we got some nice pretty lines. Okay, we have successfully created a graph starting with some data that was not at all in a good format for vizzing. Let's go back to PowerPoint and talk about a summary of what we've been covering. Takeaways for transforming the data. First of all, data interpreter. When you're bringing in Excel, it's a good thing to try data interpreter if it offers itself as a possibility. One thing in particular that it does really well is finding subtables in your Excel that you might want to bring in. If you have subtables like that, it's very likely that you'll want to union them. And with union, merging mismatched fields is the solution to sometimes the field names don't match up exactly. And Union generates that table name field that's often really useful in knowing which table something came from and how to interpret it. In case the table name doesn't start out giving you exactly the information you need, you can use a calc split, and we talked about group and alias as other tools for making it more understandable. Finally, pivot is something that actually changes the meaning of what your record is. It could have the same thing repeated many times, just slightly different, and you don't really want it that way. If you want a single price field and then something like month or whatever as a different field, then you use pivot, and once you've done that, a record has a different meaning. It's just a very unitary, single little piece of information rather than kind of a conglomeration of a lot of stuff. It's a little bit cleaner. Second half of the talk, connecting to PDF. Why connect to PDF? Well, PDF is everywhere, and the PDF files that you run across everywhere contain some really interesting tables. You'd like to bring these tables into Tableau and create a viz so that you can understand the data a little bit better. But it turns out PDF is surprisingly hard to deal with, and I'll talk about why that is as we do the demo. Okay, so what would we like to viz? One interesting set of information is about Las Vegas. We're here. What about what's happening with visitors to Vegas over the years? I was interested in that, so Googled around a little bit and discovered a web page from the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Bureau. They have a bunch of data in there. And what format is all the data in? It's in PDF. So I downloaded a bunch of this stuff, and we'll look at some of them. Let's see, the first one is historical visitor statistics. So we have, starting with 1970 down to 2016, a bunch of different things about visitors, visitor volume, conventions, and so forth and so on. I'd like to use this example to show one reason why PDF is really tricky. If I try to select some of this data, like if I wanted to copy it from here into Excel or something, start my selection up in the upper left and drag down, and look at what gets selected. It's the oddest conglomeration of columns. I'm just moving a little bit, and the selection changes radically. That is a symptom that the data that's behind the PDF isn't in a well-formed format. It's not organized really nicely. It's just whatever. And then the PDF renderer makes it look pretty, but it's not pretty behind the scenes. So Tableau's PDF connector can't just look inside the file and get nice tabular data. This is in contrast with something like HTML. Here's a random HTML data table, and if I selected this, and just as I move the mouse, all the right cells get selected. It's very organized. It's got a really nicely structured data source behind it. And so we can easily copy this, paste it into Excel. In fact, paste it straight into Tableau, and Tableau will do good things with it. If we tried to do that with PDF, it would not be pretty at all. So what does Tableau do in order to interpret this stuff if looking at the data behind the PDF file doesn't work? It does it the way you and I would do it. It kind of eyeballs it. It looks for white space, looks for vertical white space and says, that must be some columns. It looks for horizontal white space and says, that must be rows. And so it looks for the cells by just looking for white space as a graphical process, not as a data interpretation process. But if your table is simple like this one and nicely well behaved, it does a pretty good job, and we'll see that. Let's say new connection, choose PDF file, Las Vegas historical statistics, okay. Okay, it brought it in. The data looks fairly reasonable, 1970 here, a bunch of different data. However, the column headers here do not look so wonderful. We're missing all of the different field names, and the data type is string for all these things. Not so wonderful. But data interpreter says, maybe I can help, let me try. So we'll check that, see what happens. It got better. We still don't have good field names, but now we recognize that a lot of these are numbers and a little bit of strings, but things are better. This first one we know is a year, so we can manually change it from a number to a date. Okay? And unfortunately, we're going to have to manually change the field names to be something meaningful. So we can change this to year. Next one to visitor volume. And so forth and so on. If we wanted the rest, we could do all of them too. So now we're getting it into the format where we could actually viz. So let's try it. Coming over to a sheet, we can pull year into the x-axis. That looks reasonable. Take visitor volume, put it on the other axis. Okay, that's looking like a perfectly reasonable viz. We would expect visitor statistics in Las Vegas to be going up. Sort of as a sanity check, let's check out some of these dips. This is 2008, 2009, yep. The Great Recession, there was probably fewer people that came. Over here, 2001, yeah, the economy was dipping then too. So it looks like we have actually very quickly brought in a nicely formatted PDF and made a viz out of it. Cool. So we'll call this visitors. And let's move on to another one. This next one is a long PDF file that's all about the residents of Clark County, the people who live around Las Vegas, wondering what they like to do and do they like to come down and join all of us visitors in the gambling and whatnot. So here's a table on page 9 of what the local residents like to do. Let's read this into Tableau. PDF, the resident study. Now, I kind of blew past this little dialogue the first time out, but now I want to comment on it a little bit. This lets you decide whether the PDF connector should look at your entire file, which may take a while if it's a long file, because this process of reading it in isn't just a simple, looking at the data behind it. It's looking at all the graphics and laying it out and so forth. So if you have a long file, it could take a while, and if you're only interested in the stuff on one page, we'd like to let you just say, okay, focus on one page and read in that table. So we'll put in page 9. Okay. It got 2 different tables. Let's look at them. 2 columns. That doesn't look right. The other one, that looks even worse. What went wrong? Let's read this thing in again. With PDF, you could do edit connection, same as you can do with any data source, and it would let you specify your file name again. In this case, if you like the file name that you already have, for PDF only, we have this rescan PDF file command that just brings up this dialog, and you can re-specify the pages that you want it to look at. And now we will read it a little bit more carefully than we normally do when we first see a dialogue. Down at the bottom it says, the scan counts the first page of the file as page 1. It ignores the page numbering that's actually used in the file. Now, what is that talking about? Let's look back at this PDF. Page 9 is the number that's used in the file, but up top in my window header, it says, this is page 14 of 92. How did that happen? If we scroll back to the beginning of the file, there's the cover sheet. It doesn't have a page number at all. The next one, page II, IV, and several pages before it gets around to having actual page numbers. So when we were creating this PDF connector, we realized that, okay, page numbering within a PDF file is not well behaved. They could be of any format. They don't even have to be unique. You could see the page number, a page number, more than one time. The way to get around this whole problem is just to use this index, this count from 1 to whatever. And that's a way to ensure that you have a unique page number. And any program that opens up a PDF will show you what these page numbers are. In this Mac program that I'm using, Preview, it shows it to you up top. It also shows you in the thumbnails at the side. Adobe Reader also does the same sort of thing, so you can always find out what page number you really need. Now let's change it from 9 to 14. Okay, it turned this pink because we no longer have a page 9, table 2. We now have page 14, table 1. Let's look at that. Much better. It looks a whole lot more like the one we had in the PDF. That's good. We're still kind of messing up with the field names and field types, so let's try Data Interpreter as usual. Oopsie. This time, Data Interpreter took the first record of data and said, oh, that's your column headers. No, they're not. So this time, Data Interpreter messed up. So we need to say, let's not use Data Interpreter, and we'll have to go in manually and fix this stuff up. So string is a good data type for these activities. These other ones are really numbers. Just a really quick change on all of them. And fix up the field names. This was how many times things were mentioned, mentions, how often people do it, and what's a favorite. Okay, now what do we have? It's looking pretty well behaved. Let's try vizzing. We have activity here as a dimension, so we can bring that out, but those numeric values that we had to change from a string to number, evidently Tableau didn't kind of keep up with us and realize that we wanted them as measures, so we can drag them down, do a little bit more data prep here in the viz page, and say, okay, these are really measures. We'll bring out mentions as the thing that was in the first column and that was sorted on. How often people do them, how much each thing is a favorite. Okay, we have some outliers here. This is other, so we can quickly get rid of those things, and not sure, exclude that. And now we can eyeball the data a lot better than we did in just a numerical table and understand things about what people in Clark County like to do. So they seem to eat out the most, that's the most often, but there are different things that are more favorite. So we're learning something, and we can use Tableau's tools to explore, resort things by other columns and so forth, all of the interactive tools that Tableau gives us. Okay, activities. So that was 2 different PDFs. Let's up the ante quite a bit and try a 3rd one. This one is an executive summary. So it's jam-packed with a lot of data. On the first page, which we'll focus in on, it has 2 different tables. The first one is visitor volume, actual counts, and the second one is percent change. So this is very different data from one table to the other, so we certainly don't want to conglomerate all of that in together. So we're hoping that Data Interpreter will be as good with PDF as it was with Excel in finding our 2 tables on the same page. Let's try it. New data source, PDF, number 3, single page, page 1. Okay, it brought in everything as one table, which we know isn't a good thing because percent change and actual counts are not at all the same. So let's turn on Data Interpreter to see if it did a good job with finding the subtables. Aha, it found 2 subtables. Let's check out the first one, replace what we have in there. Ruh-roh, we only got 2 records. We should have had like 20 or something. How did that happen? We'll go back to the PDF and take a look at this actual data. The first 2 records in this are counts. These are numbers, visitor volume, room inventory. After that, there's a section that's all percentages. And then there's a section that's all dollar values. This is fine for a human-oriented executive summary, but this is not clean data the way any database would ever interpret it or Tableau would interpret it. You would never want to viz all of these things as the same field. It makes absolutely no sense at all. But, you know, if this is good data that we do want to viz, what can we do? One thing that we could do is think of this as a lot of little tables, and all of the percentage data could be one little table that we viz together. All of the dollar values could be a bunch of stuff to consider together. So we would really still like to get it into Tableau, even though this thing is not well behaved at all. What to do? Here's the final Tableau trick I would like to leave you with. Whenever Data Interpreter is run, it gives you this link, review the results. This was introduced in the original Data Interpreter for Excel to let you see what Data Interpreter did and let you decide whether it did a good job for you or not, and let you look at absolutely every piece of data in your original file to see if it's interpreting it properly. If we click on that, it brings up an Excel spreadsheet that tells you the interpretation of the data. The first sheet is the key. It tells you what the color coding means and so forth. The next tab is the actual data. So this is the data from page 1. And so it shows a conglomeration of that first table and the second table all together. And then there's other tables. There's one that shows you how it interpreted the subtables and so forth. What can we do with this? Well, the thing to notice is Tableau has just done the heavy lifting. It's changed from this horrible format that's really hard for a computer to read, PDF, to Excel. Excel is great. It's nicely structured. And we also have a lot of Excel skills. We can do anything we want with it now that it's in Excel. So we can take this, we can eliminate this extra field that Data Interpreter added to say how it interpreted that row. And we can select that second table, percent change, cut it, add a new spreadsheet, paste it. Now we've got the two different tables on two different spreadsheets. And we are in great shape for bringing it into Tableau, and Tableau does its usual thing with Excel and treats it really well. Now this is going to take a few more steps. There's going to be some pivoting because we have the months across the top as usual, and we'll want to filter down to things that you want to viz together. But I'd like to do a little viz just containing these bottom set of fields, which are the gaming revenues from different areas in the Las Vegas area, and show you the viz that in about 5 or 10 minutes could be created, showing over time the different gaming revenues. So this is a way for even extremely poorly behaved PDF to be made tractable, and with the usual Tableau functions, turn it into a viz. Back to PowerPoint. There are some slides in this deck for the 3 examples that I just showed you. We'll skip over those for now and go to the takeaways. So for PDF, the takeaways. First of all, the page numbers start with 1. Be sure to get that or you'll get the wrong page. Simple tables work really well. What simple means is no hierarchy, no subtables, and in particular, no text wrapping within a cell. It doesn't do very well with that. If you have a complicated table and things are not right, there's things you can do. You saw me doing them. Just very quickly change the data type from string is usually the thing that does wrong to whatever it really is. Change the field name to whatever it's supposed to be. Filter out any extraneous records that it brought in. And then the heavy lifting, if things are seriously going wrong, run Data Interpreter, click Review Results, everything will be in Excel. Use your Excel skills to make it good and bring it back into Tableau and viz away. Tableau Help also has some other tips and tricks about things that you can do with PDF. So in summary, this talk has covered 2 things. First of all, putting your data into a good format for processing, which means that each record needs to be its own data point, and Data Interpreter can help with that. Fields have to represent independent values, and Pivot helps with that. Also, various calculations and groups and aliases and so forth help with interpreting the data, making it so it's something that you and your viewer of your viz can understand. For PDF connectors, simple tables work pretty well. And if it's not so simple, the regular data prep functions and Excel can help a lot. Thank you all for coming. If this has some information that your colleagues would find useful, the session is going to repeat tomorrow afternoon. There are some other sessions that I'd like to recommend to you. There's going to be 2 instances of a session about joins and blends and when to use each, if you're interested in that. And then I'd also like to recommend to you in Tableau Labs, there are people showing Maestro and doing one-on-one sessions with people. So if you sign up for that, you can see Maestro and give us some feedback on where it's going and what you would like to see. Finally, I'd like to remind you to fill out the survey. And we're just about out of time, so if people have questions, why don't you come on up here and I can answer the questions individually. Thank you all for coming.